Good evening, folks. Welcome to InDepthNH.org's latest Zoom event. Tonight's event is about saving local news, how nonprofits are banding together. So good evening, and thank you for joining us. You know, the biggest issue for any nonprofit that any nonprofit faces is having enough funding. It's that simple. And those familiar with InDepthNH.org have seen our many pleas for donations to keep our nonprofit website up and running. We depend on good folks like you, yourselves, to support us in our mission to keep our news free and maintain our promise to never have a paywall. And we are working to fulfill our mission of holding government accountable. We have invested months and months of trying to get our obituary program off the ground, and we're now seeing small successes on that front. And we've just come off our latest fundraiser that ran in November and December and last year, and we gained a marked increase over the year before. These are significant improvements for In-Depth. Today, we're talking about another plank in our campaign to be sustainable, and that is joining with the new organization where there is strength in numbers. Our Zoom tonight is to introduce you to ANNO, the Alliance of Nonprofit News Outlets. ANNO is a network of news outlets that have banded together to encourage funders to make sure the money goes to local nonprofit news, not more bureaucracies and not more studies. ANNO's mission says it's dedicated to facilitating constant communication between its member outlets on issues of the day of mutual interest, of sharing ideas for joint activities and encouraging the funders in every available forum to put more money into local and regional nonprofit journalism. InDepthNH.org has joined this new alliance. Our two amazing guests tonight are fierce defenders of local news. Jason Pramus is the executive director of the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism and editor-in-chief of Horizon Mass, Binge's new student-driven independent news outlet covering Massachusetts and its environs. He organized this new national network, ANNO. Jason's a Boston native. He's a photojournalist, an award-winning columnist, editor, and educator with an MFA in visual arts. And I might also add, if you follow him on Facebook, the guy can cook as well, bake. We welcome Jason.
Thanks very much, Bev.
Sure.
Can I call you Bev or should it be Beverly?
Either way, okay. Bev is fine. And so let me introduce Nancy West, who has founded the New Hampshire Center for Public Interest Journalism. And she did that in April of 2015. She is the publisher and executive editor of InDepthNH.org. With many awards and 30 years at the New Hampshire Union Leader, she is passionate about government transparency. Nancy was the recipient of the Michael Donahue Freedom of Information Award given by the New England First Amendment Coalition on June 1st last year. Welcome, Nancy.
Oh, thank you, Bev.
Sure. So our guests, this is what we're going to do tonight. Our guests are going to each take about 10 minutes to talk about what's going on with this new alliance. And after that, I'll have some questions for the panel. And finally, we're going to save our last 20 minutes or so for the folks who want to submit questions. And we ask that all of these questions be submitted through the chat. And so let us begin. We will start with you, Jason. Tell us about ANNO. Where did you get this idea, and how could you wrangle an almost a nationwide organization?
Well, fine questions. And hi, everybody. So I guess I mean, I've been a journalist since I was a kid. You know, I guess I became some kind of professional journalist by like 19 or something like that. And while I was still in my first many colleges ultimately. And but I was also a political activist, on the broad left, I suppose. And kind of went back and forth between those two kinds of things. I tended to not do them at the same time, but and I've spent, I'd say, most of my life as a journalist, most of my working life. But there have been periods of some years where I was a labor organizer, community organizer, whatever, that kind of stuff, working for nonprofits and unions. So I, learned how to build different kinds of organizations and kind of learned the strengths and weaknesses of different types of organizations.
Right.
And since my sort of political sensibility, and New Hampshireites will appreciate this, is, small L libertarian. I don't mean like capital L, like the party, but, I mean, I'm a fan of freedom and I'm a fan of democracy. So I don't like bureaucracies, right? And the immediate reaction that viewers may have is like, well, you just said you were with unions, Yeah, I was. I'm also a critic of unions and the way they often run. I find a lot of labor unions are not very democratic organizations at all. They might as well be corporations, the way some of them run, which are also noted for not being very democratic organizations in the main, right? So, but just quickly, I mean, okay, so I've been a journalist for a long time. I come out of like the wild west of journalism, the underground press, the alternative press. I guess I don't know what publications people would know, but publications like the Village Voice, I guess, would be, if that
Sure.
means anything to you all, the Boston Phoenix when it existed, although I never actually worked for the Phoenix. And then Dig Boston's another publication that I ended up being a co-owner of, and which has been killed off by the pandemic economy. So these are publications that take the idea that good journalism should be independent, like independent of everybody, very, very seriously, right? And we tend to be to react strongly against what's often called mainstream journalism, which we find to be all too often, not always, but very often, kind of connected at the hip with elites, right?
Mhm.
And that kind of own everything and kind of run everything one way or the other. And to many of us in the US, I think there's a growing concern that the elites have so much control that we're ceasing to be a democracy, as at least as a lot of us, I mean, I'm 57, as a lot of us understood it when we were younger, when I was younger, for all its warts, American democracy has its merits, and we're kind of losing more and more of those merits. So coming out of that kind of journalistic tradition, um, where we're trying to be tribunes of the people, we're trying to be the voice of the voiceless, we're trying to keep track of what people in the commanding heights of the economy and politics are doing, and making sure people know what's going on so that they can try to cast their votes. They can try to comport their daily lives in a certain way so that it maximizes choice, right, for
But what,
regular
but,
people.
but
And
what you have done though is, and I don't mean any disrespect by saying wrangling cats, but you have wrangled together a group of these independent, these
yeah, people just like
individual
me. Yes.
thinkers. Exactly. You have
Yes.
been
Yeah.
able to connect with these
Right.
across the country
Right.
and get them to agree to join an organization.
To form one, yeah, and then
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, so and how? Okay, well, I will accelerate now, because journalism, as we've understood it, we talked about this last year when I was on with you all. Um, journalism as we knew it, as like the fourth estate, as like kind of the part of American democracy that tries to keep the official parts honest, has been ripped asunder from a variety of forces, right? The sort of media consolidation is one of them, right? The idea that you've got big companies, very bureaucratic, coming to eat up the rest of the news media until there's less and less and less
Right.
choice. There's less and less debate possible among different kinds of news outlets. It's becoming what we call like an information monoculture, right? That's one problem. The rise of the internet has been both an opportunity for better journalism, but I think in the balance, it's really hurt journalism in different ways, right? And there's other things besides. I mean, we needn't belabor this. Like, so journalism, the idea that people can get paid to be journalists is becoming less and less of a thing, right?
Yeah.
More and more, the landscape of information delivery has been militating towards marketing, towards public relations. In other words, towards propaganda. I mean, whatever you want to call it, if you're doing marketing or PR, you're flacking for a company, you're flacking for a government, you're flacking for somebody, right? You're being paid to do that. And most people that do this are very nice people. I'm friends with many of them. Whatever, of course, when you're a journalist, you get to know marketers in your market, So they're trying to make a living, they're doing their thing. A lot of them were trained as journalists, but can't find jobs in journalism. So they're in marketing. But you know what? There are times when what they do is perfectly fine. Like, yeah, we all want to know when a new restaurant opens. Like, maybe it's a restaurant we're going to go to. We wouldn't have known about it necessarily. There's less and less journalism. There's less and less like food reviewers that are out there checking things out. So at least you know about the restaurant because they're flacking for it. But then, like, what if the restaurant is really bad food? What if it has really bad labor conditions to the point, then it's a problem. Then the propaganda obfuscates, covers up information that people would want to know. They want to know, like, are the workers of this place being treated badly? Because, oh, my aunt, oh, my sister, oh, me,
Right.
as a journalist, maybe I'm working in a restaurant part-time because I don't have a full-time job as a journalist anymore. That's at the low level. At the big level, this kind of propaganda means we have like functionally no idea what's going on in government and in the corporate world and in the nonprofit sector for that matter. Which leads us directly to why we started ANNO. Okay, so journalism's getting ripped apart, right? And I've been doing nonprofit journalism for, I mean, really over 30 years, but heavily for 16 years now, which makes me a long distance runner, right? And Nancy's been doing it for a decade or more. When did you start?
Less, slightly less.
9 years?
Yeah,
Yeah.
9 years.
Which makes you a long distance runner. I mean, most
Right.
people that are starting news nonprofits have been doing it like 3 years or less, probably, right? And there's hundreds and hundreds of nonprofit news outlets. Well, why, right? Well, because like what's been happening in the news sector, we've been seeing the major, sort of news outlets, especially the print outlets, like the Union Leader, where Nancy and many other people used to work, being, for a variety of reasons, we kind of touched on them. We don't have time to get into it now. Cutting jobs, right? So there's less and less and less reporting jobs. Now, people either get bought out of their jobs, people like Nancy, people like me, we're in our 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s sometimes, right? And we were either pushed out of traditional journalism jobs or, we were bought out or forced out. And many, many, many of these folks, we're talking thousands in the last 15, 20 years, they're generally older women, actually. And journalism has been one of those professions where women are perhaps a majority at this point. There's always been a place for people that don't get treated well by the rest of society in journalism. It's one of those professions. It's like restaurant work, isn't it? Like all the weird people end up in journalism. All the ones who have a brain in their heads, maybe they don't get along so well with people trying to boss them around, people who have a chip on their shoulder, whatever. And also women, LGBT folks, whatever, end up in journalism, but they're also the first fired, last hired, first fired.
Right.
So they're getting pushed out. They love their communities very much that they've been covering sometimes for decades, like Nancy, and they want to continue doing it. They want to make sure that journalism does not cease to be at the local level, certainly, but also at the regional and national level. So they want to start up a new news outlet. And everyone's like, they're like, well, what economic model should I use? I've seen the Union Leader like lose advertising money. I've seen all these other, like the commercial model doesn't seem to be working anymore. People aren't subscribing to publications or becoming members of let's say public media, even, radio, TV, commercial broadcast media. People expected it to be quote unquote free. They would watch ads, listen to ads, and get that stuff. So maybe broadcast isn't doing quite as bad, but in print, right? They've seen the commercial model go away, not work. Okay, well, hey, there's this new model. It's not really new, but it's new to a lot of journalists, nonprofit, right? So in the last 15, 20 years, we've been, people like Nancy or me come onto the scene and they're hearing from colleagues, oh, you want to start a new local news outlet or regional news outlet, you should be a nonprofit, and you're going to raise money from your community. You're going to go to foundations. You're going to go to rich people. You're going to raise your money, and you're going to do that thing.
So, well, let's bring Nancy in now on those points then. Nancy, he's kind of drawing a picture of what your past has been and led you to this point. Would you tell us how you then decided to start In-Depth and join this national organization?
Yeah, when I started, there was a trend nationally for people like me who were starting news outlets to do the nonprofit route. There had been a lot of success. Right next door, we had Vermont Digger, which was growing and growing and growing, and is still growing. They had, last I checked, they had 28 full-time employees. They're like the darling of the nonprofits nationally, or one of them. And so actually I thought, oh, I'm a really good journalist. People really need this product. People will just throw money at us and we'll be fine. That was my business model. And luckily, I had access to a group called the Institute for Nonprofit News. And at the time, when I joined them, they were called the Investigative News Network. Right. And it was a much smaller outfit than it is now. It's grown exponentially since then. But it was really helpful for a newcomer because it showed me how to do a business model. I created a business plan comparing what we could do in New Hampshire compared to Vermont. And they were very helpful in that respect. But, it's a horse of a different color, as my dad would say. And over the years, I think it's become more and more difficult for nonprofits to raise money. It seems to me, in Vermont Digger, Ann Galloway was the founder, and she's always been very open about how she got started. It was a merger between Vermont Digger and a group called the Vermont Journalism Trust, which was a whole separate organization that was raising money for journalism. And we don't have that particularly in New Hampshire. So we're kind of learning as we go, but we've had a lot of help along the way from other, especially from Nonprofit News. Now, when we talk about the Association for Nonprofit News Outlets that Jason was able to get us all together, we're InDepthNH.org, New Hampshire Center for Public Interest Journalism. We're a founding member. Right. He was able to, it took a great deal of time, but to organize us into this group called ANNO. And why we joined ANNO was we found that there were many other news outlets across the country, many of us Institute for Nonprofit News members, and having a similar problem. And I was so grateful to find that other people sucked at raising money like I do, and how important that is. And just having some concerns about the whole flow of money in the charity world. I've learned, I'm so glad we did this, because I learned so much about the whole world of nonprofits. We're a full-fledged 501c3 from the IRS, and how it's different from the for-profit model. But it certainly, sometimes to me, it just looks silly. we have all of these organizations who are, for the last decade, who have been shoring up local news. And that's what all of us in ANNO are. We're local news. We're, from different parts of the country, but each serving a different,
Right.
region or area. And we have the similar problems. There's a tendency in my opinion, and from working with ANNO, for the large funders, the folks like the MacArthur Fund, the people who have a lot of money and who in the past have given a lot of money to journalism, have really been kind of overlooking a lot of the small nonprofit news outlets. I think they would say, well, we can't vet every single news outlet to make sure that we're doing a great job or whatever, but we're getting overlooked, and a lot of funding seems to be going towards what I call the middlemen, organizations like Report for America, Solutions Journalism, Institute for Nonprofit News. While they do a great job, they're also get an awful lot of money that does not flow directly into journalism. Now, as far as I'm concerned, we're on fire. We're in an emergency situation for local news. I can't tell you how many stories I have to turn away and don't even get to because we have 4 reporters who are all fabulous. We have people like Gary Rayno, Paula Tracy, Damian Fisher, me. Between us, we have about 2,000 years of experience. We've just been around forever. We know what we're doing and we're great at it. But, without a budget to pay people, we're human beings. We need to be paid for our work. It becomes very difficult. So what we're hopeful of ANNO is to, as a group, have a little more clout as to where the money's going. Now, Jason has been able to, in the first few months of ANNO, the Association for Nonprofit News Organizations, I always say it wrong,
Alliance.
has able to get
Alliance,
together.
Alliance of
I
Nonprofit
did it
News
with
Outlets.
God.
I think we've had Zoom
It's on
meetings
it's on the
with
t-shirt we have.
10 or 12 major funders already. Jason, is that right? 10 or 12 already?
We met with 10, yeah.
Yeah.
You've met
and-
with 10 major funders.
All the big ones. Yeah.
And everyone then listened to you and you told them, we're the ones that are on the ground doing the hard work.
Yes.
Why don't you give us some of the money? And what are they
Yes.
saying?
Well,
Well,
I
I mean,
think there's one thing I learned, Jason, though, was that they don't know what it's like on the ground. And several of them mentioned how great it was to hear from us. Now, there's a group pulling together called Press Forward. It's being organized, I think, by the MacArthur Fund. They're hoping to raise $500 million. That's $500 million for local news. And yet everybody we spoke to said they don't have anyone on their board or in an advocacy position telling them what it's like on the ground floor. And so we're really worried we're going to become extinct during this whole crisis, and more money will go to universities. We got to study this friggin' problem a little more. I got the recent numbers from the Employment Security in New Hampshire. I got them just last week. In the year 2001, we had 2,200 news jobs in the state. Not last year, but in 2022, there were 590 news jobs.
Yeah,
Now, that's not just reporters. That could be like press guys or press people or, advertising salespeople. But that's 590 down from 2,200. It's
Right.
it's a catastrophe.
It's worse than the national average, actually, yeah, which is about
Yeah,
60%
it is
loss
worse.
in the last 20 years. Yeah.
So
It-
Jason,
it's-
when you were talking to these people, did you actually talk to the Press Forward people?
Oh yeah. I mean,
And
let's circle back a minute because we're missing some, some steps
Okay.
in the genesis of all this. So we have the situation where all these people are starting to come online and start nonprofits, right? Starting as early as 2005, the early entrants are just handed money by major foundations like Knight Foundation in particular, whose money comes from journalism, right? And they're still a major player. Like with Press Forward, it's Knight and MacArthur that are the main players, right? And then others like Ford and some others that are involved. I think around 20 at this point foundations are involved in Press Forward. And anyway, so 2005 they're doing that. By 2007, when I come on the scene, and then 2008 when I founded my first nonprofit, well, okay, my first general nonprofit news publication. I'd done other ones before. I mean, I've been doing nonprofits of various kinds for well over 30 years. So that's another thing that makes me unusual, right? Is that I already understood the nonprofit world. I understood foundations very well from having worked with many of them, up to and including large ones like Ford, for stuff like, labor, social justice type causes, that kind of thing. And saw their caprices, saw how they were slaves to fashion, saw how they'd fund a sector 1 year and then completely ditch it, how they would fund one area of the country like the Northeast 1 year and then completely ditch it. I mean, I literally saw that happen in 2004 when they're like, gee, most of our foundations lean Democrat, so we're going to focus on so-called swing states between 2004 and 2008 in terms of funding to make sure the Democrats win the next election, and screw the Northeast, because the population centers like Massachusetts and Connecticut, they're both safe states. So we're not going to give money to groups in those states anymore. I mean, it was literally like that,
Wow.
so
Right.
that defunded my labor nonprofit, for example, and led me to, I was forced to go back to school, got interested in going back to journalism. By 2007, I'm planning Open Media Boston. 2008, I started. When I arrived on the scene with Open Media Boston, the few foundations like Knight that had been funding the early entrants for nonprofit news organizations stopped. They said, no, there's already too many of you. We're going to teach a person to fish, you see. We're not going to give money anymore directly to fund journalism. We're going to help you raise the money. Now, perhaps that was okay at first when there were like a few dozen entrants. But what happens when there's hundreds or now thousands, right? You've got one community after another going dark for professionally produced journalism in the last 15 to 20 years. So I always tell every time we met with one of these big funders, I tell them to imagine a big board and say, you've got every municipality in the US and Canada, if you want, on the board. And every municipality that has a professionally produced news outlet, at least one, gets a green light. Every community that is what we call an incipient news desert, like it's about to lose its last professionally produced news outlet, is a yellow light. Every news desert that has no professionally produced news is a red light. The red is dominating the map now. Okay, one community after another, either a town, a city, or a county, depending on where you live, is going dark, becoming a red light, right? And social media groups like on Facebook and Reddit and whatever, TikTok, that's not performing the same function that journalists performed, right? So people are not increasingly they don't have anybody who's a pro at separating, as engineers would say, signal from noise, right? So we have more and more information that's noise. It's a combination of propaganda and, if I may say, bullshit. People spewing in the absence of knowledge or understanding. People fighting, right, on social media with each other about local happenings, national happenings, international, intergalactic, just shouting at each other, right? You don't have the situation like with journalism where with newspapers, for all newspapers' faults, and there, believe me, were many and are many for those that still exist, you had pros. Usually they wore whatever their editorial line was on their sleeve, and people had to write letters, right, into those newspapers, and they had to go by, some editors to get the letters published. And it kind of preserved a certain decorum in debate, right? It was, it had its problems, but generally it kept debate calmer, right? And there was
some vicious fights, of course, but
I know,
like in
but
general
there's
terms,
far more noise now than there has ever been, and everybody
correct.
has an opinion on this.
And you've got social media giants who make money on the noise, on the
Yes,
screaming,
yes,
on the
yes,
carrying on the
yes.
dopamine being fired because people are excited about usually nonsense, right? Or
Let's
just
go back.
fun
Let's
stuff.
go back to that map for just a minute. The red light,
Yes,
the green light, the
returning to the
yellow
map.
lights. Who should get the funding? Should the red lights get the funding, or should the green lights get the funding because they're already doing a good job? And like Nancy, where would
Good,
you
perfect.
put the money also? Where would you put the money if you were a Knight Foundation?
I would definitely make sure they pay attention to the people who have been doing it for all of this time for the last 10, 15 years as nonprofits, and make sure that we don't lose them. You know, some of them are going to age out. A lot of us are getting older. We need to be able to fund bringing in younger and, emerging reporters to part of the mission. Our mission is to train emerging reporters. And without funding, that's not going to happen. And I guess that's why we're talking about funding today. And we are probably the poorest. InDepthNH.org is probably the poorest news outlet in the state. And yet I think I believe firmly we do some of the most impactful journalism in the state. And how do that's what ANNO is about, banding together so that we can get ourselves seen by the major funders. We're going to need them, and there's a lot of people looking for the money and trying to let the major funders and press forward. When you hear numbers like $500 million, you've got to look at that as, is that going to help us or is that going to hurt us? Our local funder is going to say, oh, we don't need to fund journalism anymore. Press forward fixed all that. The limited bit of information that's really coming out from Press Forward doesn't indicate that, to me, that it's going to be our salvation. I don't know if it'll harm us, but we've got to keep looking and try to get major funders to understand that not to overlook us, not to create more bureaucracies, not to have every one of the bureaucracies that is sort of the middlemen have all sorts of costs that aren't going into news. Why? We have a project right here in New Hampshire that's what I call a shiny object project. And it's going to take citizens who are going to be paid $50 a meeting. They're supposed to go to meetings and attend them and then call up a reporter and tell them what happened or something. It's duplicative because if a reporter like me wants to know what's going on at a selectmen's meeting, most of them are being published on their local cable channel or read the minutes. In the real world, what really happens if somebody goes to a meeting and they're pissed off, they call a reporter. I got a call today from a senior citizen, an old lady. I'm also an old lady, so I say that with respect. Who's living in her car with a cat. Her cat, of course, it's not a strange cat, but people have real problems here. And I want to get this story covered as quickly as I can in between a million other things that are going on. We cover the State House very well. We have a lot of issues that we take on that we feel need to have a lot more input. I don't mean to get off the track, but ANNO is banding together so we can get more money. We need money. Our budget last year was 181,000, way more than we had in any previous year. But that's a tiny smidgen of what is needed to run a news organization that can somehow create a business side that can bring in revenue.
Our budget was about the same, and the vast majority of certainly the newer entrants But the vast majority of nonprofit publications have budgets under 150, 100,000 a year. Now,
I think
the
that's
red light,
what most publishers are making. Plus, in the
I make
for-profit
37,000 a
world.
year still. I probably said that last year. It's still the case. So like the red lights, Bev, right? All these communities that have lost professionally produced news. Who are those communities? Those communities are flyover country, right? Those
Yes,
communities,
yes.
or here on the coast, like I'm in Somerville, north of Boston. They're the equivalent in sort of they're non-elite communities, right? They're working in middle class communities, right? Be they white, black, Latino, whatever, whatever mixture of different kinds of folks. They are not elite communities, right? Where we see, as Nancy was kind of inferring earlier, nonprofit news outlets doing the best are the rich communities wherever they are, right? And so around Boston, that would be Concord, Massachusetts, Lexington, Massachusetts, places like that. Not although Somerville has a lot of money in it, there's still a lot of working people here in Somerville getting driven out now, but there's still a lot. And then when you get out, anywhere outside major urban areas, and even in certain neighborhoods in major urban areas, though, in other words, most American communities are red lights already, or they're on their way, right? They're yellow lights. So let's talk. We're in July 2022, and I'm seeing all this, and I'm seeing that my colleagues and I are about to. We were very proud of something we called, and I think I talked about with you all last year, a hybrid economic model. We had a commercial, so-called alternative weekly newspaper, Dig Boston, right? And we had Binge, the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, which is a nonprofit, right? The nonprofit was at the time, in 2022, would have been 7 years old, and the commercial paper we'd had since 2017. So 5 years at that point. So the pandemic was in the process, through its deleterious effects on our economy, was in the process of killing Dig Boston. Dig Boston had just been starting to make money 3 years after we took it over in January 2020, when the pandemic hit a couple months later. Immediately went into a tailspin, lost all our advertising. That happened to us again in April 2022. So we lost our print operation again for a second time in April 2022 of Dig Boston, right? And like the salary of the three principals who ran both Dig and Binge came from both of those publications. We'd lean on one side or the other of the enterprise, depending on which had money. And only rarely, actually 2020 was the only year we ever had money from both, really. So I made a maximum of $50,000 a year, right? As did my colleagues, Chris Ferrone and John Loftus, right? So in April 2022, with the print operation for Dig going dark again, with there being no more federal money coming from the Small Business Association of any kind for small businesses, including small newspapers like Dig Boston, Dig was finished. It was only a matter of time. It officially went under in June 2023. But in July 2022, it was on its way out. Binge was in the middle of waiting what will become 7 months for a grant from our major funder, right? And the caprice is that nonprofit news organizations are going to make all our money from small donations from regular people. That's garbage. You have to have larger funders, or you're never going to have nearly enough money to even have a small staff. So while we were waiting for this late grant to come in, we are broke, and we're still running even though we're broke. So I write an essay called Share and Share Alike, in which I describe a situation where, like everything else in life these days, there's an elite strata of nonprofit news outlets that started with lots of money, are connected to the biggest funders and to very wealthy people and institutions, and always had a lot of money, and they were doing fine. But most nonprofit news outlets were not at all in that elite strata. We had never had a lot of money. We started with no money in most cases. We started with savings of people like Nancy and me, whatever savings we had, which isn't usually much. And then, whatever like interns we can get,
people we know that are willing to work for 50 or $100 a story just to get stuff out there. And we're doing our thing and we're trying to figure out how to raise more money. And we're getting that whole teach a person to fish garbage from these giant foundations with tons of money. And I'm like writing this essay saying, this is a problem. Okay, we need a situation, first of all, where funders develop a national strategy and say, look at these yellow lights, look at these red lights. What are we as funders, understanding that even if all the major funders come together, they themselves would not have enough money to reverse the collapse of journalism, but they could at least help better and more strategically by dividing up the money better and giving it to those red light communities, to those yellow light communities, not essentially to green light communities or to green light outlets that just have a ton of money already by our standards or by anybody's standards. And I'm like, this is what we need. And I go to the journalism press and I'm like, because I published it in my own outlet and I sent it around to friends like Nancy, who I'd met a few months earlier. And by the way, as the years went by, people like Nancy and me helped start these organizations like the Institute for Nonprofit News, and in my case, the local independent online news publishers network, which is called Lion Publishers. I was a founder of that, okay, over 10 years ago. And we did not start. Yes.
Jason, real quick, I got a related question. Dig Boston, did it have a regular advertisers or was it a daily or a weekly?
It was a weekly and it had advertisers. Yeah, of course. It was a 24-year-old publication when it went under, right? So we acquired it for its debt in June 2017. My colleagues Chris and John had worked for it for years previous. I was a columnist for it a couple of years previous, but I had not been a staffer at it. But I ended up being one of the new owners along with Chris and John. So in any case,
Can I just jump in and ask a question here? I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulty on my end, and I missed some of the conversation, but are any of these big funders listening though?
Well, I'll get to it. The only thing I have to say that's important is that there were these groups that Dick Toffel, who used to be the head of ProPublica, which is a big, well-funded national and international journalism operation, with money from all the bigs, all the big foundations, all kinds of rich people. He himself has become kind of a critic, not exactly like Nancy or me or people at our level, but enough of an ally. He called groups like Lion and INN intermediary organizations, and he questions why they're getting so much money but not giving a lot of it out. And basically what ended up happening is people like Nancy and me, we banded together already before in groups like Lion and INN, only to see those groups become our own gatekeepers, where the major funders are going to them and they're saying, you all determine who is worthy of getting money and who is not. That is not why we started these organizations. We started those organizations to help ourselves. And we ended up creating a bureaucracy filled with staffers that make six figures when most member outlets, most of the publishers and editors are making tiny amounts of money, doing it for the love, doing it for democracy. But we're going to all collapse. Okay? Most of us are going to go away. So this is what led me to say,
I have
what
to
is
butt
going
in here, Jason. I have to butt in. We're not going away, folks.
All right. Good spirit, Nancy. So
I have to live forever, but we are not going away. I see what you're saying, and we belong to INN and Lion, and over the years, look at how many jobs have been created at INN. I mean, it used to be a lean staff, very helpful, and still does a lot of great work. Without INN, we wouldn't have Newsmatch, and Newsmatch is the only reason we can stay afloat, and it's a pittance of what we need.
But basically, as things evolved, I started saying behind the scenes, and then I started writing, and then I noticed the journalism press, which is mostly now nonprofit and connected at the hip to the same major funders that fund the elites in the nonprofit news space, and therefore doesn't want to criticize those foundations, so didn't publish me, right? I'm like, we don't need to start civil wars in the intermediate organizations. That would be stupid. It would be self-defeating. There's no reason to do that. But why don't we start a very horizontal, very democratic network? That's what I'm getting to here, Bev. I mean, like it took over a year to do, because it is like herding cats. And you cannot start, nobody wants to start another bureaucracy with Jason at the head, with Nancy at the head, getting the big money to like mete out little tiny bits of money to our peers and just recreating the same problem. So I'm like, look, let's start a group that is, and this, I guess I'm going to skip over some stuff, but I managed to gather some of the cats together in a national listserv, and we wrote a letter, about 10 of us, to funders. We got 17 organizations to sign the letter by May 1st, 2023. And we then went to 17 major funders and medium-sized funders that funded journalism. And we said, meet with us. We want to talk, because what's happening right now is not working. In the middle of that process, we found out about what became Press Forward. I knew about what became Press Forward. I knew the MacArthur Foundation and others, Knight and others, were doing something in September of 2022 because of doing all this. So we were at the point of meeting with funders. We met with 6 funders, and some of the funders themselves are like, are you going to start a new group? And I'm like, yeah, let's do that now. Okay, I think we have critical mass. We announced it, and we do everything extremely democratically. Nothing happens without a majority vote of all the outlets. And I'm like, okay, outlets that we have here that have signed this letter, do a bunch of you want to start a new group? This is what I suggest we call it, the Alliance of Nonprofit News Outlets. And it's all for one and one for all. Like we are a communications network. Beverly read our mission statement at the beginning. I wrote that. Like I came up with the name, all this stuff, you know, and people like, yeah, we like this mission. If nothing else happens, I said, and we're just a free communications network where we can analyze the situation we're in, bring in new people and talk about whatever we want, we're going to do that. But if we can agree on stuff, if a majority of current member outlets, and remember, we're growing. Since we started in August of 2023, we've almost doubled now the number of member outlets, and we are fully national. We're all across the country. We have 32 news outlets. Now we're at the point like, are we going to be able to come together? We took a poll last month, actually earlier this month, of the 32 member groups, and we got the most support for like 3 or 4 things. The top thing was something I suggested, which is like, let's write another letter, this time together with funders that have been very friendly to us, which are usually medium-sized, not the largest funders, but the medium-sized ones. And we hear from Press Forward, from MacArthur, from Knight, from Ford, that one of the missions of Press Forward, with all the money they're raising, which mostly, by the way, is not new money, keep in mind, right? It's money that was already apportioned to journalism. They're trying to be a little more strategic about how they do it. So let's, and one thing they're saying they're going to do is encourage all the many foundations out there that do not fund journalism to start doing so. So we're like, okay, we're going to take you at your word. We're going to have a letter. We're going to ask you funders in Press Forward to sign the letter along with these few funders that we already know are going to sign, that we have waiting in the wings. And the letter is going to say to funders in our, let's say in New England, okay, Boston Foundation, Barr Foundation, Hyams, Abrams, all in Boston. They don't fund journalism regularly. They do it almost randomly, and they'll like fund the Boston Globe. They'll fund the outlets that need the money the least. WGB,
Right.
oh, here's $750,000 to become more diverse. But they won't look at the dozens of outlets in New England that started the way we're describing and go, oh, gee, if we don't help these groups, we're going to lose journalism in this region except for these elite outlets.
Right.
Let's fund them. So we're going to take the letter to them, Bev, and we're going to be like, okay, sign this letter, come along with us, you know, like start funding journalism. And we're going to also, as Nancy said, start to, in one way or another, by just being at conferences, because we're starting to be everywhere, you know, and just pushing, fund us, give us general operating money, give more money to the entire sector, not just to us as individuals. Maybe we'll get somewhere. Okay,
Well, I think you've nailed it. We will not be ignored. and I suppose they cannot fund us or fund us, but Dick Toffel also brought up in one of his essays the fact that we really ought to be covering as news, what are the major funders doing? How are they operating? Are they being transparent? And, I think one of the things we're going to try at InDepthNH.org, we have really, like most of the nonprofits that are doing a really great job, we have a lot of readers who really care about us. They are not millionaires, most of them, probably all of them. I don't know. I don't have any millionaires in my Rolodex, but they really care about us. And I'm going to ask maybe in the spring for a petition, to sign a petition that to suggest to the major funders and funders right here in New Hampshire that are ignoring us, to make sure they understand the problem. Part of it is my own problem for not getting the word out to our readers, how desperate the situation is, how they're not getting the news that they really should get. And there's another problem we haven't even brought up yet, and that's that some of the new outlets that are coming in are very partisan. We have in New Hampshire one news outlet that is definitely right-leaning, makes no bones about it. We had another new one that came in just a couple of weeks ago that they cater to left-leaning readers. They make no bones about it. They do left-leaning news. I didn't even know you could do left-leaning news, that there was, that you,
Well,
that's the
so-
thing. I don't even, actually, I probably shouldn't, it's like Fox. It's not news. Let's call it what it
Nancy.
is. It's
Nancy,
propaganda.
Nancy, I have a perfect segue question here from Marie Morgan. In New Hampshire,
Yes.
how many small newspapers are there? Is there a list? How many online news organizations are there? Are there lists available for these things? Are there places we can go and kind of get a feel? Can you see the right wing, the left wing, even if they're not, set up like that? Is there a place where we can get kind of a catalog?
Well, this is where people have to become media savvy. The group that just came in is called Granite Post. They're part of a bigger outlet, a bigger group that has, I think, 7 or 8 of these left-leaning news outlets operating today. They're well-funded. They have very good jobs. The gentleman that they hired for their first reporter is the former spokesman for the Democratic Party. I called them up to just chat and see who they are. And they make no bones about it. Left-leaning, we're left-leaning. And we have right-leaning. My fear is, and everybody's fear should be, that we're going to go back to the old days where you got your left-wing papers and your right-wing papers, and you're not getting unbiased, fearless journalism. One thing I don't think anybody seems to be taking into account in giving out grants is quality of the product in whether or not you're doing fair and unbiased news. Now, as to that question, there's a list of newspapers on the New Hampshire Press Association website. My guess, for statewide coverage, I think there's about 5 or 6. There's really not a lot of statewide news outlets, whether they're in print or online. And as far as the nonprofits, I learn of new ones every day. The other day I found out there's one out of Nashua. I would consider it more of a blog, but apparently it's a new news outlet that I can't quite remember the name, but they're popping up everywhere. And you'll see them way more popular now because of the presidential race coming up. That, we'll see. At one point, New Hampshire had 11 Republican-leaning websites ready to go. And I checked the other day, they're still up and running, but they haven't been posting a lot of news, a lot of it's old press releases, that those are for-profit online news outlets. People worry about the Russians bringing in propaganda. We got enough of that happening online, and it's not something that's getting a lot of attention. And in New Hampshire, it's something we should be paying attention to. InDepthNH.org, part of the reason we're so poor is we spend all of our time, too much of our time, worried about news as opposed to grants and jargon and being able to tout ourselves as great as we are. Oh, somebody
Nancy,
else had a question?
we have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you about Bob Charest wrote a question about the Knight Foundation has recently stated they're looking for some kind of return on investment for their charity dollars, or some kind of proof that our livelihood is working, that we're surviving and thriving. How do you deal with that?
Probably
Also
fund some intermediary group to rate us all, some other shiny object to waste charity dollars.
I mean, this is an example of covering for the fact that foundations largely make busy work for a lot of us that are trying to do useful stuff for society. They inflate their own importance, and they set themselves up as arbiters, as judges for those of us that are actually on the ground doing things. Like, okay, I mean, I understand a lot of people watching this will be like, journalists don't do nothing for society. I mean, you're entitled to that opinion. We, as journalists, we think we do, right? We think we're trying to help, democracy do its thing, right? But this is also true of people that are trying to feed hungry people. This is also true of people trying to make sure that people get an education, right? This is also true of people that do all the stuff, like make sure that there's hospitals, doctors, nurses, all this stuff, right? So the people who say that in foundations, think about that. Return on investment for feeding hungry people, for like having hospitals and schools. That's kind of a weird approach, isn't it? I mean, unless you are, and there are people that believe that like literally everything should be run, like a business. I got news for you people. Most American businesses are incredibly inefficient. So if you think business is better than different kinds of public charities that do stuff on the ground, or even government at the local level, I don't think the numbers and studies really bear that out. But yeah, I mean, I'm sorry they said that. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're getting close to our wrap-up time. Nancy, do you want to give us some final thoughts, and then Jason, we'll go back to you.
All I can say is we're trying to get the message out. I think it's important for people to realize that without these small nonprofit news outlets, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. We're going to see a lot more partisan news. I think that's going to be on the rise. We're going to see a whole shitload of problems when AI, artificial intelligence,
we didn't even get into that.
over.
We haven't got That's another topic for another night.
Well, they claim they're going to free up our reporting. And so by doing some of the grunt work relative to, say sports scores or real estate, I don't buy it. I think they'll be in the news reporting business that people will look at, and it will look like real news, and it's not going to be.
They'll be destroying our jobs, just like they'll be destroying all kinds of other jobs for no good reason. Yeah, so
that's one hurdle after another, but that's going to be a huge one. And I think that's something that's we all really ought to be close. I guess all I can do is pay better attention to it. And I just want to remind like the people that are watching, especially the ones from New Hampshire, we would not be still in business without individual donations. We have donors that give us $3 a month, and we have donors that give us $100 a month, or just one-time donations, 5, 10, 20, 100. We have very few major donors. So the people are really, keeping us in business, and we're grateful. It's just, we need to get more money so that we can start to even try to become sustainable. And that means having a business division. And I think we were talking earlier, we've been promoting our obituaries for over a year, and Bob
yeah.
Shrest does a great job with getting photos. We have, we want to do a book on cemeteries. We just kind of really get into obituaries, and it's starting to pay off. People are,
Mhm.
we are the home of the $99 obituary, where if
Right.
you want to go to the, any other news outlet, it's going to be minimum $400 or $500 for even a very short one. People shouldn't have to go to Facebook to get people to turn out at funerals, for their loved ones. They need to have, that, and it's starting to pay off. I think there is a sustainability between our readers and obituaries and some other areas that we're looking into, but we need that major funding to
Right.
really be able to build. We can stay at this plateau and crawl into another year with modest growth, but we need some major growth to really keep us not just surviving, but thriving. There's stories that go untold.
Okay, and so Jason, how about take 30 seconds and on a final thought from you, and then we'll be closing off here. All right, Jason, 30
Sorry, I
seconds.
took your
Yeah, we
time.
barely I mean, we didn't have, we should have done a longer thing, or maybe do more than one. I guess we should do another one. There's no time
Let's do
to talk
another
about
one.
salient stuff. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, all right.
quickly, we really need to talk more about the situation we're facing. We also need to talk about the role of government in all this, which and we need to talk about what foundations actually are, which is tax write-offs for extraordinarily wealthy people.
Yes.
That money should be going into the tax base to allow for more things like better funding of public information that people need. And then how do we make that money? How do we make that kind of money fund independent journalism? Is the interesting discussion. So
Okay.
anyway, bye folks. Thanks for having me.
Well,
All right.
yeah,
No,
and
all
also
right.
we should just congratulate Jason for pulling ANNO together. I'm so
Yes.
grateful to have a place to go. It's a learning experience, and I think we will get the attention we need as a result. Thank you, Jason.
You're
Yes.
welcome.
Well
Thank you for participating. I mean, if people weren't doing it with me, if other publishers weren't involved, we couldn't get anywhere. Now we'll see if we can do anything at all other than inform ourselves of the speed of our own demise.
Well, we'll try to keep it, we'll try to slow that demise down, please.
yes.
we'll
Well, thank you,
to.
Jason. Great talk though, and you're right. There's so many other topics that we can then get into in the future. And Nancy, more talk about what In-Depth is doing would be an important part for us also.
And I know we have to close soon, but I do want to mention that if you read InDepthNH.org tomorrow and every other news outlet in the state worth its salt, there should be an editorial about House Bill 1002, which wants to start charging for right to know requests. After an outlet makes 10 requests, they want to start charging 10 hours of search. They want to start charging $25 an hour. This is just horrendous for New Hampshire, and I hope citizens will call their legislators and tell them we do not want this. The Republican committee, the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee is hell-bent to get this through. And the State House, New Hampshire House of Representatives is voting on Thursday. So if you have time, or even if you don't have time, make time to get a hold of your local lawmaker and say, do not pass, kill House Bill 1002.
Okay. All right. So Montana, if you're there, I think we're going to be closing off, and another great Zoom event, a little technical trouble here and there, but all in all, this has been a really interesting evening, and I thank Jason Primus and I thank Nancy West and Montana West in the background for all the good work that you've done for us as well. And we'll say good night, and Montana, I'll let you take it over.
Thank you, Beverly.
Thanks, Nancy.
And everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Jason, Montana, Bob Shrest.
if they're there. Hang on one second.
Montana's still there.
Is he? Okay. Can we go into the chat and